So this topic of the triage of medical resources in halacha was very much a theoretical discussion in the past. There's never been a situation that we've been in, such as we are today, where in first world countries, particularly across Europe and the United States, Italy, France, Spain, the UK and the United States are daily now having to deal with this question of who gets the scarce resources. And this has moved out of the theoretical realm very much into the practical realm. There was always a possibility that we would have to deal with these kind of questions on a one-off situation. For example, if there was God forbid, a terrorist attack, and there were many casualties which arrive in a hospital all at once, or if there's a, God forbid, a chemical warfare attack where people many people are injured. Those kind of situations are multiple pile-up in car accidents where a whole bunch of very poorly people turn up at the hospital all at once. These are one-off situations which we would necessarily have to think about dividing scarce resources. But in a pandemic such as we're in, which is basically the worst pandemic that this world has known for 100 years, since Spanish flu in 1918, these questions are being asked on a daily basis. A few weeks ago in Italy, the doctors there were literally having to make life and death decisions on who would get treatment and who wouldn't. And this was something that in the 21st century, in first world countries, we never ever imagined would happen. So with that sort of in mind, we need to think about how we would go about making these very difficult decisions. The first thing we have to say is that on a societal basis, it is incumbent on every proper moral society to do its best to make sure that these kind of resources, equipment, personal protection equipment, ventilating equipment, and personnel, doctors, nurses, healthcare workers, that all of this is in place, obviously before a pandemic arrives and we have to deal with it. So it goes without saying that the responsibility of society, as opposed to the responsibility of individuals, is very great in this situation. It is, in an ideal world, there would be no shortage of equipment, there'd be no shortage of transplantable kidneys, there'd be no shortage of anything. We don't live in an ideal world, and this current scenario that we're in, this current pandemic, is certainly a wake-up call for that. So let's have a look and see, from the point of view of halacha, how we're going to deal with a scenario of choosing who gets what in terms of medical equipment. Now, as you all know, the halacha is based on the Torah, which is interpreted, the Torah Shebaal Peh, which is interpreted Torah Shebaal Peh, which accompanied the oral law, which accompanied the written law. The Torah Shebaal Peh was written down for us in around about the year 200 by Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. Along came the Gemara 300 or so years later, and then picked apart the Mishnah and gave us help onto what the Mishnah really meant. And then after that, we had the period of the Geonim, and then the Rishonim, and then the Achronim, and up till the modern day Halachic decisors known as Poskim. And it's an unbroken chain of interpretation and logic. Now, you won't find in the Torah or the Mishnah or the Gemara, you will not find anybody talking about a scenario where there aren't enough mechanical ventilators for people with coronavirus. Because, of course, that didn't exist in those days. But the concepts of how we arrive at modern day halachic decisions, the concepts are all taken from that historical process, from the Torah through the Mishnah, through the Gemara, through the various different interpretations of it. So in order for us to look at our own situation and to try and get some halachic perspective on this, we have to go and look in the sources to see what we can find. And I'm going to share my sources sheet with you now, if I can find it. There it is. Okay, now I'm just going to put that over there and that over there on my two screens so that I can still see you. Right. Can you all please give me a nod if you can see the if you can see my source sheet? Yes. No, Howard can't see it. You can't see it, Howard?
Not. Sorry, I'm trying to unmute it.
You should,
not. No.
You should be able to see a
little
sheet
bit to one side.
You ought to be able to see a sheet that says the division of scarce resources and triage in halacha.
Yeah, but I can only see 5 and 32 lines of 36, and then it's
right.
Visible.
Okay. Can everybody else see that clearly?
No.
Anybody not see it clearly?
No, it's not clear at all.
It's not clear.
I only see 5 and 36.
It says here my screen sharing is paused. Let me try again then. Okay, let me try and share it again and see what happens. How about that?
very
Better?
good.
Yes? Okay, good. All right. So let's start straight away and dive in to the Torah itself, the written Torah, Sefer Vayikra, Leviticus chapter 25, and here it is, verses 35 and 36. V'chi amuch achicha umatei yado imach v'echzakta bo ger v'toshav v'chai imach. If your brother becomes destitute, we're talking about poverty here. If your brother becomes poor and his hand falters beside you, meaning he needs money, needs help, you shall support him, whether he is a convert or a resident, doesn't matter whether he's a convert or somebody born into the Jewish nation, so that he can live with you. V'chai imach, so that he can live with you. And then the next verse, you shall not take from him interest. Here we're talking about loans. We're talking about somebody who lends money to another person. You're not allowed to take interest or increase. And you shall fear your God. Let your brother live with you. And the rabbis ask a fairly obvious question. If we did not have in both of those verses the last bits, so if we did not have so that he can live with you, and we did not have and let your brother live with you, would the verse make sense? If it just said, if your brother becomes destitute and his hand falters beside you, you shall support him, whether he is a convert or a resident, full stop. You wouldn't say to me, hang on a minute, why doesn't it say so that he can live with you? In other words, what does that add? It doesn't seem to add anything. The same for the next verse. If it just said, you shall not take from him interest or increase, and you shall fear your God, that would be understood very clearly that we're talking about not allowing interest to be taken. What does it add by telling us, and let your brother live with you? Now, you will be aware that the concept that we have is that the Torah never wastes a word or even a letter. So if it's in there and it doesn't seem to add something, then we're missing something. And that's what the rabbis in the Gemara here, source number 2, Talmud Bavli Baba Metzia, page 62a, for those that want to look it up. They quote this pasuk, V'chai achicha imach, your brother shall live with you. And then the next bit, return the interest to him so that he may live. And if you go there, bit where my number 6 here, where my pointer is, the Gemara asks a question, and it asks, what does he do with this verse? What does Rabbi Yochanan do with this verse, and your brother shall live with you? In other words, what does he learn from this? We must learn something. It's not there for just to make up the space. And the Gemara answers, he requires this verse for that which is taught in a Breita. A Breita is a discussion between the rabbis that didn't quite make it into the Mishnah, but nevertheless is an important piece of information from the rabbis. And listen to the story that they were discussing. If two people were walking on a desolate path and there was a jug of water in the possession of one of them. So you're walking through the desert and you've got one jug of water, one jerry can of water. And the situation was such that if both of these people were to drink from the jug of water, there wouldn't be enough water and they would both die before they could get to any other water. But if only one of them were to drink the whole can of water, the whole jug of water, then he could survive till he reached the next source of water. So there is a dispute as to what the halacha is. So the question is, do both of them drink and then both of them die? Or does only one of them drink and then one of them will definitely die and one of them will live? So there is a dispute as to the halacha. This chap here called Ben Petora, he said both of them should drink and die because let neither one of them see the death of the other. So you can't have a situation where you drink all the water and you see your friend die. So better you split it and que sera, sera, whatever will be, and then they'll both die. And this was the accepted opinion until Rabbi Akiva, the famous Rabbi Akiva, came along and said, no, this verse that we were talking about over here, and so your brother shall live with you, your brother shall live with you. Rabbi Akiva uses that verse to teach us that your life, the person of the life of an individual, takes precedence over the life of somebody else. So Rabbi Akiva says, if a person is going through the desert with another person, and person A has a jug of water, a container of water, then he has the precedence over the other person, because his life takes precedence over the other person, and it belongs to him. So he disagrees with Ben Petora as to the halacha. According to Ben Petora, you would have to split the water and both would die. According to Rabbi Akiva, the person who owns the water would drink the water and live, and the other person sadly would not make it. That's the basic Gemara. There is another Mishnah which I want to bring to your attention, which seems to give us a different angle on this whole question. And here we are at source number 3, where my pointer is over here. This is a Mishnah in Masechet Horiot, and it's talking about who we must redeem as a captive. If you have a whole bunch of people who are taken captive by terrorists, bandits, whatever, there's a whole hierarchy that the Mishnah gives as to who you have to redeem first. Let's assume that you don't have sufficient ransom money to redeem everybody. So who gets redeemed first? And the Mishnah tells us, and before the ladies jump up and down in disgust at this Mishnah, let's get through to the end of the Mishnah before you jump up and down and get excited, because the first bit seems extremely sexist. Ha'ish kodem le'isha. A man supersedes a woman to keep alive and to return a lost object. Why? Okay, maybe we'll have time to discuss why at a later point later on in this discussion. But let's just go through it. A woman supersedes a man to clothe and to free from captivity. So the second part of that Mishnah calms down the ladies and shows us that the Mishnah is not just being sexist here and says that men are worth more than women. There is a difference in what we're talking about here. If we're talking about a woman who is naked and has no clothing, and we've only got money or a garment to provide clothing for a woman, she takes precedence over a man. Similarly, to free from captivity. If you have a man and a woman who have been taken hostage, and you only have sufficient ability to release one of them, the Mishnah tells us that a woman should be released before a man. Okay, I'm going to unmute you. I'm going to unmute you if I can see how to do that with my screen being shared. Yes, there we go. I'm going to unmute you. And I want to know if anybody can tell me why they think that that a woman would be released before a man. Any offers?
Well,
yes, Howard.
Presumably because a woman can produce life, provided she can find another man. But I mean, you can't. Two men can't make a baby. But if a woman is available, free and released and free, then maybe she can find someone else and create new life.
Okay, I mean, I would argue that the logic's not quite there, because the man could go and find a woman. So no, I'm not buying that, Howard. Anybody else any offers?
well, if they don't release her, it's possible she may have a child from this mess that she's in, and that would be a disgrace.
Yeah. Okay. That is absolutely correct. The reason that a woman supersedes a man is that the chances are that if a man and a woman have been captured, it's more likely to have been captured by a man, and the woman is more likely to be raped than the man. And so therefore, it is our responsibility to release the woman before the man. However, and here the ladies can get upset again, if they both stand to be disgraced, in other words, if there's an equal chance that either of them will be subjected to that kind of abuse, then the man supersedes the woman. The explanation for that is unfortunately the fact that in the time of the Mishnah, the value of men and women was decided on the basis of their value as slaves. That's how it worked. And a male slave is worth more than a female slave because they're stronger and they can do more physical work. So that's the basis for that particular Mishnah. Now, let's carry on, because that wasn't really the main part that I wanted to discuss with you, but I just wanted to throw in a bit of sexism there to just get everybody wound up a bit. The next bit of the Mishnah is the more important bit, because this Mishnah now gives you a whole hierarchy of who comes before whom. So a Kohen comes before a Levi comes before a Yisrael, and a Yisrael comes before a Mamzer. A Mamzer is the product of an illicit relationship, and a Natin, which is a member of the Givonites, supersedes a convert supersedes a freed slave. And then this is a very famous Mishnah indeed, and it says, when does that apply, this whole hierarchy of value, if you like, and as to who gets the resource? When they are all equal in their standing. And then we have this famous Mishnah, Aval im haya mamzer talmid chacham. If you have a mamzer, the product of an illicit relationship, who happens to be a great Torah scholar, and you have a Kohen Gadol, a high priest, Am Haaretz, who happens to be an ignoramus and doesn't know anything, Mamzer Talmid Chacham Kodem LeKohen Gadol Am Haaretz. The whole hierarchy gets put upon its head, and the Mamzer Talmid Chacham comes before the Kohen Gadol Am Haaretz. So the scholarly bastard, it's not a great expression, but it'll do, comes before the ignorant high priest. So this whole Mishnah seems to raise for us a problem in the terms of triage of resources, because now what the Mishnah is asking us is to make value judgments on people. First of all, it tells us we've got a caste system, caste or caste, however you pronounce it, C-A-S-T-E. We've got Kohen, Levi, Israel, Mamzer, convert, freed slave, or in a whole list. And then we then told, no, that's only if they're all equal. We have to start making value judgments now. And so that seems to be a bit problematic and seems to conflict with the Gemara over here, with our story of the jug of water. So we have to find out what's going on here. What's the difference between the two cases? And it's suggested here by Dr. Moshe Sokol, who has written a lot about this subject, source number 4 over here, that the reason for the traveler's case, where we've got water in a jug, is that is a divisible source. You can split that water into 2, okay? But the case from the Mishnah in Horayot is where it cannot be divided. You've got one ventilator, or you've got one oxygen mask, or you've got one doctor. It's not a situation like the water where you can split it. So Sokol maintains that only when we have indivisible resources do we talk about this hierarchy, or what's called yichus in Hebrew, this whole hierarchy. Now, we need to have a look back at our Gemara here and look at this case in a little bit more detail. We have 2 opinions. Ben Petora says you split the water and both of them die. Rabbi Akiva says you do not split the water. The owner of the water drinks it and the other one passes away. Now, there are 2 very different views on what the basic concept that these 2 great people, Ben Petora and Rabbi Akiva, were arguing about. The Netziv, Rabbi Naftali Tzvi Berlin, as you can see, lived in the 19th century. He says that the discussion between them is whether we make a distinction between something called Chaye Sha'ah or Chaye Olam. Now, Chaye Sha'ah is literally means life of hours, as opposed to Chaye Olam, which means life forever. So, in other words, what he's suggesting is that this is a basic discussion as to whether, when you have a resource and you have two possibilities to give that resource out. Person A, if you give that resource, will live for a short period of time. His prognosis is very poor. He's going to die anyway. So let's take our modern day scenario. You've got one ventilator and you've got two people. One of the people is suffering from a terminal disease. Let's say, God forbid, a terminal cancer. And he is likely to die. Let's make it easy for this discussion. He's terminally ill. He's likely to die within the next 30 days. On the other hand, the other person to whom you could give this ventilator is a otherwise perfectly fit person. He's got his coronavirus and he needs ventilation, but he has no other underlying problems. And all things being equal, if we can get rid of the coronavirus, he's going to live to a ripe old age, and he's not going to die within the next 30 days. So the terminally ill patient, who is going to die anyway, whatever you do, because he's got underlying illness which is going to see him off. That's called chaye sha'ah. You can give for him temporary relief. You can give him life maybe for a maximum of 30 days. Whereas the other chap, you could give 30, 40, 50, 60 years, who knows how long of life with this resource that you have. In our case, our ventilator. In the case of the water jug, we're talking about the water itself. What Rav Naftali Tzvi Berlin, the Netziv, says is that the basic discussion between the two opinions is whether we say that Chaye Sha'ah is just as important as Chaye Olam. In other words, can we make a distinction between that short amount of life that we can give to person A as opposed to the long amount of life that we can give to person B? The logic would tell us, if you weren't one of those two people, or if you weren't one of the relatives of those two people, logic would tell you, well, you've got a resource, you want to use it to the best ability of that resource, we should give it to the one who would have Chaye Olam. But there's a problem with that, because we believe, Judaism believes, and it's a very, very strong and potent belief, we believe that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, God, is infinite. And we also believe that we are made B'Tselem Elokim. We are made, every individual human being is made in the image of God. And what does that mean? It means that we have inside of us a piece of God. HaKadosh Baruch Hu breathes neshama into us, as it were. Hashem is within us. We are Hashem, and Hashem is us. And if Hashem is infinite, and we have a little bit of Hashem in us, then we also have infinity. You can't split infinity. You can't have a bit of infinity. So that means, by definition, every breath of life in Jewish thought, in Jewish law, in Jewish thinking, every breath of life is precious. And we have a pasuk which we say from Tehillim, which we say every morning, Kol haneshama tahalel ya. Every neshama, every soul should praise God. And the rabbis say, don't read it as Kol haneshama tahalel ya, every soul should praise God, but read it slightly different, Kol haneshima, which means every breath. And from here the rabbis learn that every breath of life in a human being is precious and infinite. And if that's the case, which is a fundamental Jewish concept, how can we make a distinction between Chaye Sha'ah, somebody who will live just for a short period of time, and Chaye Olam? Because maybe those few seconds, minutes, days, or weeks of the terminally ill person, maybe that value is just as valuable as the 30, 40, 50, 60 years of the other person. Or maybe that person of 30, 40, 50, 60 years will not live 30, 40, 50, 60 years. We don't know. So the argument between the two rabbis, Ben Petorah and Rabbi Akiva, is whether we accept the concept that Chaye Olam overrides Chaye Sha'ah. And if we look at the opinions, Rabbi Akiva is the one that says, drink the water, sorry about that, drink the water yourself, and the other person has to pass away, because he believes that Chaye Sha'ah does take precedence, Chaye Olam takes precedence over Chaye Sha'ah. In other words, saving somebody for a longer period of time takes precedence over saving somebody who's in a shorter period of time. And of course, Ben Petorah, the other way around, he says, no, Chaye Sha'ah, a temporary relief, is just as important, and therefore it's incumbent. We can save two people, even if it's only for a short period of time. They're both going to die. But nevertheless, every breath of theirs that we manage to save with these few drops of water is of value, and therefore we can't split the water. So that is the fundamental discussion between these two rabbis in the water case, according to the Netziv. And so if you hold like Rabbi Akiva, which appears to be that Chaye Olam, somebody who can live for a longer period of time, would get precedent, if you apply his opinion to our current scenario of the coronavirus and insufficient equipment, then what we're asking the doctors to do is to make a medical evaluation. Now, it's very important that we talk about this as a medical evaluation. It's reasonable to ask the doctors to make a medical evaluation. Person A is likely to benefit from this ventilator more than person B. And therefore, according to Rabbi Akiva's view, and according to the Netziv's interpretation of Rabbi Akiva, they would be able to make that decision and say person A gets the ventilator. Excuse me. What we can't ask them to do is to make a moral decision. What happens if you have two people come in? One is a healthcare worker or a fireman who are regularly doing wonderful things, putting their lives at risk for other people. And the other one is a downright rotten fellow. He's a bank robber, a murderer, whatever you want to think of. What we can't do as doctors is to make that moral distinction. That's a different question, and we'll come to that in a little while. But the distinction on a medical basis, according to what we've learned in the Gemara over here and the Netziv's interpretation of that, we are entitled as doctors, nurses, and healthcare professionals to make medical quality decisions as to who will benefit most from the resource. Let's go on. The other major view on what the distinction between the two rabbis was about is by this gentleman here, Rabbi Chaim Ozer Grudzinski, who lived in the latter part of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century. And he says, no, what the two rabbis, Ben Petorah and Rabbi Akiva, were discussing was not a question of who would benefit most from the resource, but the ownership of the resource. So what Rabbi Chaim Ozer Grudzinski is saying is that, are we talking here about water which belongs to one person? And he says that that is the distinction. Rabbi Akiva says that the one person should drink it because it belongs to him. He does not have to sacrifice his life for somebody else. And he brings as his proof our verse over here, and the Gemara itself, which says that this verse here, and your brother shall live with you, not that your brother should live instead of you. Because if you were to give him your water and you were to die, then that means that he's not living with you, he's living instead of you. So Rav Chaim Isaac Grzinski, who's known as the Achiezer, we'll call him the Achiezer because it's easier to say. The Achiezer says that this discussion over here, our Gemara, is about who owns it. Now that whole argument is not applicable in our coronavirus situation. Unless, of course, somebody owns their own ventilator. Let's just go to that for 2 minutes. Somebody who owns their own ventilator has no responsibility to give that ventilator up for somebody else. Even if that person is higher up in the yichus stakes or is likely to live longer, if you own the resource, according to Rabbi Akiva, you have the right to have that resource. But that's not the usual situation. Our normal situation is that the ventilator is jointly owned by everybody. It's owned by the hospital. It's owned by a third party, which really effectively is owned by everybody. So the two people that come in and require that ventilator, in our situation, there is no question that we should say, oh, well, it belongs to him so he can use it. It belongs to them equally. So if you were to look at the argument of the water jug on the basis of what the Achiezer says, it doesn't apply to our situation. So what the Achiezer would say is that doesn't apply, and so therefore, as a default position, we then have to move on to this side of our page to source number 3, which is the list of yichus. Now, do we have any Kohanim here? Yes, we do. I can see at least one Kohen. Mervyn Bloch is a Kohen. Any other Kohanim here? Any Leviim here? Yes, we've got a Bat Levi. Liat is a Bat Levi. Okay. Now then, if I was to ask Mervyn, I'm going to unmute Mervyn Bloch now. And Mervyn, I'm going to ask you a question. Mervyn, can you prove to me that you're a Kohen?
I say, yes, my dad was a Kohen.
Okay, how can he prove he was a Kohen?
He'll tell me his dad was a Kohen.
Okay, so he can tell you what he likes. Has he got any proof?
No.
No. Okay. What about you, Liat? Can you prove you're a Bat Levi?
Yeah, but going way back to all the generations.
Yeah. You can't bring me a piece of paper that proves you're a Bat Levi. We assume you're a Bat Levi because your father was on his ketubah, and I've seen it, says that he was a Levi. And Mervyn, I believe you that your father was a Kohen, but you've no proof of that. So in today's scenario, there was a man called Rabbi Yaakov Emden, who lived even before the Achiezer and before the Netziv, as you can see from source number 7. Rabbi Yaakov Emden, a very, very famous rabbi from the 18th century, he says that in today's society, talking even back then, we have no proof of yichus. Nobody can prove that they are a Kohen or a Levi. And when we are talking about matters of life and death and triage of medical resources, we can no longer, oh dear, hang on. We can no longer rely on the yichus of a Kohen and a Levi because we have no proof. And in order to go along these lines of this yichus here, Levi Yisrael, Kohen Levi Yisrael, we have to have proper proof. So Rabbi Yaakov Emden says it's all very nice theoretically, but unless a Kohen can come and show me his birth certificates all the way back to Aaron a Cohen, I'm sorry, I'm not having it. We cannot rely on the fact that he is a Cohen or a Levi, and we cannot rely on the Yichus. He also says that when we're talking about the famous part of the Mishnah that I told you, Mamzer Talmid Chacham, what's a Talmid Chacham? Who is to say who is a scholar? We might think he's a scholar. You might think I'm a scholar. You might be very mistaken. I might be making all this up. And again, what Rabbi Yaakov Emden is saying is that really what he was saying is that this Mishnah was a theoretical Mishnah, and in practice, we cannot apply rules of yichus in society when we're talking about triage of resources. So we have to look for another angle to see how we can share out these scarce resources. There is a Gemara in Masechet Horiot, which is discussing the very Mishnah that we talked about. And he says they make an extension of this hierarchy. And he says, the Gemara says that the Mashuach Milchama. Now, the Mashuach Milchama was a special Kohen who had one job only. He had one job, and that was to take the people out to war. He was Mashuach, means same word as Mashiach. He was anointed. He was given that job of Milchama. He was the guy that led them out to war. He was the Kohen who would lead the people to war. He was a very important person because he was the one that gave the spiritual impetus to any war that the Bnei Yisrael took place. And those of you who of my lot who've been attending the Shoftim Shiur will know that they were fighting every 5 minutes. There were wars every 5 minutes. And there was a person called the Mashuach Milchama, a Kohen, who used to go out in front of them, leading them out to battle, and was a spiritual leader, spiritual war leader. And he, according to this Gemara, takes precedence over the sgan. The sgan, everybody knows what the word sgan means. It means the deputy. The sgan was the deputy Kohen Gadol. When it came to the service on Yom Kippur, the Kohen Gadol had to go into the Beit HaMikdash and had to do the whole service there that we read about on Yom Kippur. And if he didn't, then the people didn't get their kapara, their atonement. So we needed to have a Kohen Gadol. Now what? We got very worried. The Gemara in Masechet Yoma gets very worried. What happens if the Kohen Gadol, something happens to him on the night of Yom Kippur? Yom Kippur night, he goes to sleep, and either he doesn't wake up in the morning, God forbid he dies in his sleep, or something happens to him that he becomes impure, ritually impure. He touches a dead body, or he comes into contact with other things that would make him tameh, and he's not able to do the service. Then what we're going to do? All the people are not going to get their atonement. Can't have that. So they said, I know what we'll do. We'll appoint a deputy Kohen Gadol. Erev Yom Kippur, we'll get a deputy, the vice president, and he will be locked away somewhere, so he can't, no mishaps can come to him. And if, God forbid, something happens to the Kohen Gadol, he can take over and do the service. Fine. He's called the Sgan Kohen Gadol. The Gemara tells us that the Mashuach Milchama, the war leader, has precedence over the Sgan. And Rashi says there, if you look in source number 8 over here, Rashi explains, and that's because, and this is a quote, the nation needs him, this war leader, more than they need the Sgan. So in other words, he's more important. Now, that raises all sorts of questions, because now we're being asked to make value judgments. There were, as you, many of you will know, very recently, the British Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, was in hospital with coronavirus, and he was in intensive care. As it happens, he didn't require a ventilator, but he was in intensive care and was very close to requiring a ventilator. Now imagine a scenario where Boris Johnson's in intensive care and there's no ventilators left, and he's the Prime Minister. Or you've got another scenario where you've got one ventilator left and Boris comes in at the same time as a tramp off the street, a hobo. Who do you think's going to get the ventilator?
I don't know. That's the question.
I think we can be fairly certain that Boris would get the ventilator in that scenario. And in fact, this Gemara would seem to imply that that would be correct. In fact, after Boris came out of hospital, there was a whole bunch of loony lefties who were complaining that, oh, it's not fair, Boris Johnson got better treatment than anyone else. He's the Prime Minister, for goodness sake. Of course he got the best treatment. And our Gemara here in Horiot would actually support that, because Boris would be more important to the country. Well, I suppose you could debate that as well, but assuming that you believe that the Prime Minister is an important person, he would be more important than the homeless hobo. And so therefore, according to this Gemara, that would be correct. But that's a very difficult thing to do. It might be obvious if the President or the Prime Minister comes in versus, you know, somebody who's low down in the socio-economic ladder, let's say, but it might not be obvious. What if you've got two people of similar standing? So who's going to make those decisions? So this Gemara gives us a bit of difficulty. So Rabbi Yaakov Emden, our same Rabbi Yaakov Emden that we were discussing over here, he says that we can think about maybe about the performance and fulfillment of mitzvot. Okay, maybe the whole reason that our yichus over here, which says a man supersedes a woman, maybe he says that's all to do with mitzvot. Men have more mitzvot to do than women, and therefore if you save a man, he can do more mitzvot than a woman can do, because women are not obligated to do as many mitzvot as men. And then he says, well, maybe that's not the case. Maybe we're talking about holiness. You have a holy woman who would keep all her mitzvot versus a unholy man who won't keep any of his. So then again, you're being asked to make value judgments. And all of these things, the bottom line, Rabbi Yaakov Emden says, is that we as human beings cannot make value judgments. These questions here are in the Gemara and in the Mishnah are all scenarios where we have a situation where all things are equal. Now, we can never have a situation of all things are equal because every human being is different. So what Rabbi Yaakov Emden was saying, and bearing in mind he lived over here in the 18th century, he was saying we can't make value judgments. We don't make value judgments. This Mishnah and this Gemara is not pertinent to today's thinking. Now, one of the things that this demonstrates to me very, very clearly, and it's a very important side point, but it's definitely worth mentioning, and that is that the rabbis, and nobody would be able to turn around to you and say that Rabbi Yaakov Emden was a Reform rabbi, okay? The rabbis were not averse to taking a Mishnah and taking a Gemara and saying, today, that doesn't apply. And that is a very important concept that we have to consider. Now, not everybody is of the stature of Rabbi Yaakov Emden that can say that. So I can't just say, well, you know what? I don't think that Mishnah doesn't suit me, so I think we can just do away with that. I can't do that, and neither can any of you. But Rabbi Yaakov Emden can, which means that we have the ability within the framework of halakha to dynamize, to modernize within the concept of halacha without being accused of throwing away Torah, without being accused of being reform or conservative or any other insult that you might want to throw at somebody here. It's perfectly permissible for people who have the knowledge and the ability to be able to modernize and dynamize and look at the halacha with modern eyes. Let's just move on because we're going to see something very interesting here. What we now talk about is the degree of need. So the rabbis say that when presented in a manner in which there may be equal demand on a physician's talents, there is precedence in halacha that would require the physician to treat the patient who is in most need. Now, that's obvious if you, let's take the example of a car accident. Somebody comes in bleeding to death from an injury, and somebody else comes in with a tiny little scratch on their forehead, right? It's obvious that you're going to deal with the person who needs you the most. That's obvious, but it's not also always so obvious. So again, the doctors here are being asked to make judgments, but what they're being asked to make is professional judgments, which they have the ability to do. They're not being asked to make value judgments. They're not being asked to make ethical judgments as to who is more important than somebody else, or who deserves it more because they're frummer or keep more mitzvot, or any other kind of value judgment. It's purely a medical decision, and that's the source for the previously quoted Mishnah, where it have, if a man and a woman are both at equal risk of being degraded, then the man takes precedence over the woman. And remember, I said to you, well, I'm not going to tell you why that is. The Mishnah tells us that. The commentators explain that the reason, now you may or may not agree with this, but the reason that this Mishnah says that the man takes precedence over the woman when they both might get abused is that, generally speaking, if you abuse a man, I don't want to go into details, you're all adults, if you abuse a man and rape a man, that is likely to be more painful and more degrading than for a woman. Now, that's a debatable point which I don't want to get into, but that's what the commentators applied that Mishnah to. So in other words, what they were doing was not making a value judgment about men and women, and not making a value judgment about Kohen Levi Yisrael. They were making a judgment, in their opinion, as to who would suffer the most from this abuse. So therefore, if you had a child, let's say a female child versus a male adult, then the child would take precedence, because the concept is not a value judgment of men versus women, child versus adult. It's a medical decision as to who requires the resource the most, and that is the most important point that we will come to. We've come to so far, is that all the stuff we discussed before, of great interest though it is, of theoretical interest, of the yichus and who gets what first, is on the basis where all things are equal. But in a situation where all things are not equal, the degree of need is the overriding factor. Now, let's throw in something else. God forbid, a person is working in a hospital. Let's say he's a surgeon. Two people come in that require his attention. One of them is a relative. Let's say, God forbid, a son, daughter, wife, whatever. And the other is a stranger. Does the doctor have permission, according to halacha, to go to his relative first? And does that relative take precedence? Because natural instinct is to want to do that. I'm sure everybody would agree that the natural instinct would be to save your own relative first. And interestingly, the Gemara discusses this concept, but it discusses it not in the aspect of medical care, but rather in the aspect of charity. So if you have a limited amount of money that you can give to charity, the poor of your family takes precedence. So in other words, the English expression charity begins at home is a halachic concept. After your own family, then the people of your own city, and only then the people of Eretz Israel, and after that, the people of everywhere else. So the reason for that is because you have a connection to your family, you have a connection to your city, you have a connection to your people, to your land, and then you have a connection to humankind. And it's, if you like, outer circles. It's like ripples in a pond. And the Gemara tells us that we are allowed to do that. It's human nature, and we are allowed to give our charity to our local causes, family, local causes, rather than further afield. When there is limited resources, we should try and give it to both. Bottom line, very interesting. We have because we'll run out of time, but the bottom line is really verses, sources 12 and 13. According to Rabbi Yaakov Emden, the bottom line is the ability to maximize life. Rabbi Yaakov Emden holds, like Rabbi Akiva, that Chaye Olam is more valuable than Chaye Sha'ah. Going right the way back to our jug situation, jug of water, Rabbi Akiva said, the person drinks it, we can save one person, we don't sacrifice two, we save one. Rabbi Yaakov Emden agrees with that. His view is that a young man before a healthy old man before a sick one, a sick man before a castrated male, we'll come to that if we've got time, and then before a critically ill patient, and a critically ill patient before a trefa. A trefa is somebody who is cannot live for a specific period of time. So his opinion, Rabbi Yaakov Emden's opinion on the triage of resources is you use that resource to its best ability. Whoever will benefit the most gets the resource. Now, completely opposite to that is Rabbi Moshe Feinstein. Many of you will have heard of him. He was the most famous of the poskim in America in the 20th century. Died around 1984, something like that, I think. Excuse me. So he has a completely different view. Sorry, just need to switch this off. Okay, sorry. So Rabbi Feinstein says a completely different concept altogether. And he says, basically, first come, first served. Whoever gets there first, he is the one that the doctor must treat. So, and he says that this Mishnah in Horiot, all those hierarchies are when everybody arrives at exactly the same time, which of course can never happen. So he says, look at this last paragraph here in source 13. As soon as a patient enters a doctor's care, he is entitled to that care until it is delivered. Rabbi Feinstein does not give any source for this concept, but its inclusion among many other contemporary poskim seems to indicate some uniformity in the acceptance of this moral obligation. So what he's saying is, a doctor who is dealing with an ordinary person, and he's busy dealing with that ordinary person, and the president or the prime minister comes in, he's not allowed, according to halacha, to leave the person he's treating and go and treat somebody else who's more important. Now, the question is whether these two, Rabbi Emden's approach, which is maximum benefit, and Rabbi Feinstein's approach, which is first come, first served, are mutually exclusive. Now, if you're dealing with a person and you're thinking, I don't think I'm getting anywhere with this person, I don't think this person's gonna live, and then another person comes in that needs your care, you then have to make a decision as to whether the maximum benefit would be for you to leave off the person you're dealing with now and go and deal with the other person. According to Rabbi Feinstein, you wouldn't be allowed to do that. According to Rabbi Emden, that's what you ought to do. And that is a very, very difficult decision to make. Usually what you would be able to do, hopefully, would be find somebody else to come and take over where you left off, at least to hold the fort while you went and go and sort out somebody else and maximize the benefit. But those are basically the two halachic approaches which we apply despite the fact that there are Gemara and Mishnah which gives us hierarchies. The bottom line is that in halakha today there are two approaches. One is how can we maximize the benefit of life, and secondly, first come, first served. What we don't do is we do not make moral judgments. We don't make a judgment on who is deserving of something on a moral basis. All human beings are made in the image of God. Everybody is B'Tselem Elokim. Everybody has the right to the resource until such time as somebody needs it more, according to Rabbi Emden, or somebody gets there before you, according to Rabbi Feinstein. So the halakha helps us in some ways. It doesn't give us clear answers because it's a really difficult thing. And the responsibility that we are placing on the medical, the nursing, and the healthcare staff at these times is a huge burden. I heard some Italian doctors speak in really heartbreaking terms as to what they were being asked to do by their healthcare systems, because there just wasn't enough equipment. They literally had to decide who was going to live and who was going to die, and that was really, really difficult for them, of course. Those of you that are interested, I can send you this. This is a little bit. This is from a secular perspective, a professor of law at Stanford University, and it's not that different to what the halakha suggests, although he does put in number 4 over here, promoting and rewarding social usefulness. Halakha would not approve of that. Maximizing total benefit, yes, we'd agree with that. Favoring the worst off, not necessarily. If the worst off is a hopeless case, there's no point. He may be the most injured, but if he's almost dead, then we wouldn't put him on because he's not maximizing benefit. And then over here, he suggests that one of the ways you could do it, as well as first come, first served, would be to do a lottery, draw lots. Well, that's obviously very difficult. So just to summarize, we have Mishnayot, we have Gemara, which tells us the concepts. We have the idea that Chaye Olam overrides Chaye Sha'ah, according to Rabbi Akiva, which is the halakha. We have the two approaches of Rabbi Emden, who says maximize the most possibilities of your resource, and Rabbi Feinstein, who says first come, first served. And we should all bless and pray for the decisions to be made correctly by all the people who have to make those decisions. I'm going to unmute you all, so anybody that's got any questions? No, I'm going to mute you all again. Right, anybody who's got any questions, wave, shout, or unmute yourself. Okay.
I wondered if you have an answer to when do you turn off the ventilator? Once you made that decision,
Okay.
how do you know that this is, you turn off the ventilator?
That's a very good question, Nachum.
80%.
Let's assume we have, and I'm glad you asked that question because it's a very important question. If you have a person on a ventilator and somebody else comes in who needs that ventilator and he's got a better chance, according to halakha, you cannot switch off that ventilator. Once you have somebody on a ventilator, you cannot switch it off. What you can do is you can stop providing care. If you think it's a hopeless case and this person is not gonna make it, you can, for example, not top up the drip. You can't take the drip out, but you can not put the next bag up. You can, and in fact, in terms of the ventilators, what they do in Shaare Tzedek Hospital, which is a hospital run strictly according to Halacha, what they do is they have backup batteries. All these ventilators have backup batteries. Now, if you if you needed to switch off a ventilator because somebody else needed it, and this person, you have made a halachic decision that this person who's on the ventilator is not going to make it, he's only got chaye sha'a, we've got a chance of saving somebody for a longer period, you can't switch that off. What you can do is you can switch it onto the backup battery, and then you can allow the battery to wind down, because then you have not done an act. There's a difference between not doing something, i.e. not renewing the battery, and actually switching it off. It's a technical difference, but it makes a huge difference. It makes a huge difference to the people who have to do it as well. So the answer to your question is you can't switch people off, but there are things that you can do to enable the ventilator to be used for a more beneficial use, but only if that person is a hopeless case. You can't do that just because you think that you want to use it for somebody else.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Johnny Halpin.
Have you you said that Shaare Tzedek run on Halachic principles? Is that the right word for it? Have you found that non-Jewish hospitals, do they follow these sort of principles? Have you found in your
Okay,
sure
so Shaare Tzedek as a matter of policy have a rabbinic council which is manned by people who are very great rabbis and very great doctors at the same time. Professor Avraham Sternberg, Professor Avraham, Professor Halperin, these are your name. These are people who are professors of medicine and also great halachicists, and they make decisions on policy decisions from the hospital, which is not necessarily the case in every hospital. I think Laniado also runs on those kind of grounds. Hadassah does not. That's not to say that they do things wrong. Chas v'shalom, I wouldn't say that. But I know for sure that Shaare Tzedek has a rabbinical medical council on which decisions of principles are made by them. Any other questions? Any other questions or comments? Okay.
Yeah, what about the issue